Today we're painting a simple gradient sky, and then we're going to do some fluffy clouds on top of that. And I've done a lot of experimentation on this subject in particular, and there is one brush that is superior to the rest for this subject of clouds. There's also a really specific technique to use for these light, airy, wispy clouds if you want them to look realistic and random. It's a good rule of thumb to begin with the part of the painting that's the farthest back and then work your way forward. So the sky is painted first, and the background is just as important as the foreground. It sets the mood for the rest of the landscape, and that should never be an afterthought. So here we have our T ruler, and we're marking our horizon line that's slightly above center to focus more on the lower part of the canvas, which will be completed later. We're using cobalt blue, just a tiny bit of raw umber, some cerulean blue, and titanium white. I've chosen the largest brush that I feel comfortable with, which is a 2-inch flat brush. It's perfect for sky. And there's two different methods to use here with this flat brush. You can use long, smooth left to right strokes, like I'm doing here. And there's also a technique, crisscross or figure 8 technique here. Both cover quite nicely. And that is the goal for our first layer here, is just to cover canvas with paint, cover that white canvas. So I'm using a combination of both of these techniques for now, as I'm just getting a vague impression of what colors are going to be in the sky. More vibrant colors up at the top of the canvas and fading towards the horizon into a little bit lighter blues and whites down by the horizon. It creates some space and distance down there. It's always easiest to blend the light hues into the dark, so we'll start building the sky's gradient more intentionally on the second layer here. I like to darken the corners of my sky. It automatically draws your eye in towards the center, towards whatever that focal point will be later. It's just a nice little trick. You want those nice long smooth strokes to go completely from one end of the canvas to the other. We don't want to stop in the middle. It will leave a mark on your canvas where you stop. It's always tempting to feel like, oh, that's good enough. I want to move on to the next step. But it's really important, especially with the sky, because it is our first step, that you get it as close to perfection as you can, your own perfection. It's really hard to go back and fix something from that very first layer. So stick with it. I felt like the corners were a little too dark, so I just lightened those up a little bit, make it look a bit more realistic. And she's looking nice and smooth, so That looks good to me. And next we'll move on to our clouds. There are 10 different types of clouds, but for this painting I chose a basic white fluffy cloud. We are using titanium white and using this round brush. It's a number 12 round blender brush. If you feel a little bit uncomfortable with going right in with your cloud, feel free to pencil in an outline. My brush is barely wet. I dipped it quickly in the water and dried it off on the paper towel very well, and it has very, very little paint. So as you can see, I started with little paint and I am just moving it around with circular motions. I am alternating between clockwise and counterclockwise motions. I do about 5 and then switch to the other and do another 5 and switch. And I never stop moving my hand or the brush. That's probably the most important thing with clouds. Keep your hand moving. You don't want to get it stuck. They look really beautiful and fluffy and transparent when the paint is starting to run out. That's when you get that fluffy look. So we want to keep that. If you're not quite sure, start practicing with too little of paint rather than too much of paint, and the same with the water. Start with too little of water. It's almost a dry brush, just the slightest amount of water. And I'm just keeping my hand moving and moving, just random shapes. We want the majority of our clouds to have soft edges. This will make the cloud appear more realistic. It also pushes the cloud into the distance because there's such a lack of detail that it looks like it's farther away. The clouds towards the horizon line should be even farther away. They will be smaller and softer and even more transparent. And clouds are so random. We want to make sure that the shapes aren't the same. We don't want any shapes replicated within the clouds. And continuing with that circular motion. If you do the circular motions and your clouds are looking like cartoon clouds, cotton candy, it's because your hand isn't moving enough. You kind of getting stuck in the same spot. So keep that hand moving. Now we do want soft edges for our clouds, but as you can see in this little guy here, that there's kind of a hard edge up there at the top. And it can be really nice to combine a few hard edges amongst all of the soft edges. And that will really bring out the realism in your clouds. Clouds need several layers. and your highlights pop out a little bit more every time you use more white. So you're probably going to use 3 to 5 layers of clouds to give it lots of depth. Make it jump right off the canvas. Parts of the cloud are going to be more dense, just naturally. That's how they are in nature. And then you can just stretch them out with your dry brush. Just keep those circular motions going until you completely run out of paint on your blender brush. And again, those little small clouds closer to the horizon will push them back in the distance and automatically bring forward those larger clouds. I'm just going through one more time, picking out the highlights where our sun is hitting the cloud. Just a little dab here or there. And these are just tap tap motions for the whitest whites. If you want to stop every few minutes and stand back, it will change your perspective quite a bit, and you'll be able to see where your highlights need to be. And this looks really close to being done. You don't want to overwork it. It's kind of hard to stop once you get started. And that looks pretty good. And stretch out a few more of these. This is a dry brush. Very, very little moisture on the brush and very little paint.